Welcome back, everybody, to Between Two Sermons. So great to have you with us.
Good to be here.
Yeah. Rob?
John?
You did it again, man. You
I
did
know.
it again.
Did it
Another
again.
sermon in
Right.
the
Isn't that
book.
a song? You did it again.
Yeah, I
can't
get.
remember.
Yeah. Who was that by?
I can't
don't know.
remember.
Joan Jett and the
Something.
Blackhearts.
Yeah,
I know.
something.
I don't know.
Something like that.
Yeah. Anyway.
No one knows who Joan Jett is.
Yeah.
But you and I did.
Yeah, that's right. So, great job
Thank you.
again this week.
Thank you.
True Church was the title of this week's sermon. And just to catch people up, if you weren't able to listen to it yet, you talk about kind of a surreal, crazy story of Jesus. This isn't your typical storybook Jesus that we're reading about right here. In which Jesus goes into the temple kind of at nighttime, makes some observations, he retreats, he has this weird interaction with a fig tree that he curses, and then it doesn't produce any fruit, it withers.
Right.
And then he goes back into the temple, he churchy people say cleanse the temple.
Right.
He actually gets a whip together, puts the thought behind it to actually craft a whip and to turn tables over.
Right.
Not your typical.
No, definitely not.
Like not a lot of pictures of Jesus doing this.
No, and I think even when I was reading about it, I mean, commentary. So this has been obviously 2,000 years, and there were still a lot of thoughtful commentators over time that tried to make sense of even the fig tree seemed to bother commentators more than the temple cleansing, because maybe there was some sense to the temple being used improperly or whatever. But they thought, the poor tree, so it's definitely very unusual. But what I think was helpful, and you can't do a lot in a sermon, is it's one of these passages where I think a lot of streams, let's say, Old Testament teaching come together, and even in that one verse, he quotes two prophets in just one verse. It's just words, this is a house for prayer for all nations, and then the other one, it says den of thieves or den of robbers. It's just a quote, and if you didn't know that, maybe the first one you might, because it seems like a quote, but you might think that Jesus is just being offhanded. This is a den of thieves or a den of robbers, but that one line is part of almost a whole chapter. I think it's Jeremiah chapter 7, that for readers then and now, it helps makes sense to what Jesus is doing. And so that's number one. And the whole thing about the fig tree, again, you wouldn't know this without reading more than this passage, that the fig tree was throughout all of the Old Testament. There are many references, and maybe in the sermon guide there's a few references, but of the fig tree representing Israel. It's an image. So Jesus it's kind of like a parable. So yes, the tree, this particular tree, didn't do so well, but he's making a strong point, and he's making a point, you might say, about the complete inefficacy or the complete failure of the Jewish worship system. They didn't have a bad Sunday. He's trying to say this whole system has become so corrupt, so corrupt, that it is no longer serving the purpose of being, as he says, a house of worship. And so, and it's been a long time coming. So I think it's still, I don't know, ruffles our feathers, or it challenges our sense of who Jesus is, but I would say, as I said in the sermon, Jesus isn't like you and me. He doesn't, just wake up angry or read a bad letter or get angry by the news of the day or someone forgot his birthday or whatever. You never see Jesus exercise that kind of anger. It's, righteous anger or righteous indignation. And even that verse in 11, it says, I think it's there for us to a degree that it helps us, that Jesus comes at night. And I remember it made me think of when Nehemiah, those who remember that, when Nehemiah didn't tell anybody what he was doing. If you remember the story of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, when he was sent to rebuild the walls, and he didn't want to cause a stir to the peoples that would eventually not want Israel to rebuild the wall. It says he just went up there at night. Never forgot that. And he walked along the broken walls on his horse, I think. And he was just sort of taking it in to say, to observe and maybe make some kind of observation about the nature of it. So this is what Jesus does. In verse 11, he comes in from this beautiful triumphal entry, which we didn't read, but that's the big part of the way the passage opens. And then he's in the temple at night. And the impression is, nobody's there. But it says he looked around at everything. And I think that's helpful to say, what's about to happen is not someone who had slept on the wrong side of the bed. This was very well thought out, and I hope that helps, because that's really what's going on.
Yeah. And you kind of took this in a different direction than what I was expecting or what I have heard a lot of times in terms of the reason Jesus was provoked to anger. Like, what was it that really caused him to feel that intensity of anger? I've heard a lot of times, talking about the money changers there, the sacrificial system there. They would charge a lot more.
Right, they'd make a little money on the exchange.
Make money off of the exchange, and maybe more than a little money, and maybe that's what Jesus was. And that could be a part of this as well. But you mentioned something that was different.
My sense is, and that's why it's also can be a lot there. I think certainly there's, and every commentator and pastors have said this for a long time, that there is the commerce seem to maybe overwhelm the worship. So that's a big part of it. But I think because of the Isaiah quote, the emphasis on the Isaiah quote in that verse says, he is, I think it's verse 18, or 17, maybe 17, when he says, this shall be a house of prayer for all nations. So what Jesus was, I think, irked at was not so much just the selling of animals that was prescribed in the Old Testament, the having the temple tax that was prescribed in the Old Testament, and even having the reason for the exchange was, this is an odd little footnote, is that they didn't want to use coins that had images, back to the next sermon coming up, it wanted to be an imageless coin to try to keep it from any kind of, over connection to Rome. So that was all prescribed. None of that was wrong. But I think, as I've come to understand it, that those series of exchanges happened both then, even that day, outside of the temple too. There wasn't just one place to do your thing. There was, in some cases, it would swell to tens and hundreds of thousands of people for a big festival. So they couldn't all do it there. They would have places around the temple, but it had encroached. And over time, the temple of the court of the Gentiles, which was huge, it might have been the size of a football field even though it's not in that same configuration. That's huge, okay? But it had been largely overtaken, and I think Jesus is saying, this is the only place under the current system that non-Jewish people can come. No, they can't go into the inner sanctum, so to speak, but they're always, from the beginning of when Solomon built it, the court of the Gentiles meant Gentile people can worship God here, and now this has become you've become so indifferent to people that aren't Jewish that, you're not telling them they can't step foot here, but you've basically crowded out their space. So I think the real reason, my sense is, that Jesus takes the action he does is to make a point, and it's about that. It's about the temple had become, in the imagination of Jewish people, maybe not all of them, of course, but let's say the leadership, it had become their thing. It had become their shrine. It had become more and more exclusive to them, and that was clearly never the intention, which is why that passage is quoted.
That just reminds me kind of even that conversation we were having with Dr. Richard Middleton when he was talking about the Ark.
And that's a great example.
If you had the Ark on your side, God was automatically on your side. So like the assumption, we have the temple, therefore we're in line with what God wants because we have the temple. Rather than are we really...
No, that is right on. In fact, Jesus, in quoting Jeremiah 7, which he does, is really, you could almost say it's like, here we go again. It's what happened in Jeremiah's day, which was all of this prophecy. You've lost your way. You no longer have covenant faithfulness. you've become corrupt, and you've turned the temple, that temple, two different temples, you've turned that temple into this sort of, safe house, for you, and that you can live however you want because the temple has this promise of God that it's going to be here forever. It's become an idol almost, and it got torn down. And Jesus is quoting this 700-year prophecy saying, here we go again. Yeah. The same thing is happening here. And one other thing that's interesting, I know you and I and some others were just talking about it, the temple also had become a political institution. It was more. It's not so much in our day where we have these things are a little more differentiated. But the temple was, of course, the house of worship, that is religious worship. It was the place where the power. I'm talking about there was a Roman government, but the people who exercised power underneath the Roman government, let's say the authorities, they were actually scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees. They were connected to the temple. They were the same people. Most of the financial transactions for the worship of Israel, which was went beyond the temple, happened there. So this place was more than just the church house or the worship house. It was all these things bound up together. And that, you might say, marriage of politics and religion, really,
yes,
turned out to be a very toxic mix. And one of the reasons Jesus said in the next chapter, we're tearing this thing down.
Yeah.
So I do think there's some lessons for us to learn. There's some not one for one, but some parallels, some overlaps here as we live in a moment, which we're living now, where politics, or certain brand of politics, and religion are intertwined.
Yeah. Wow. That's really good. I think really important for us to consider too. And I loved how you kind of ended with really allowing us to see that the sacrificial system that was going on there is actually replaced by Jesus not too long after.
Right.
And we ended our time together. You focused us on the Lord's table and how that actually is the whole sacrificial system upended, essentially. Jesus not only cleanses the temple, but says, I'm doing away with the whole system.
That's
now.
right. That it was so huge. I mean, I've read the passage before, like you, but when I read this one, it's a little different in each gospel. Like John's has the cleansing of the temple in the beginning, and there's all these different. They use them differently for different theological purposes. But here, I think Mark is the only one, if I'm not mistaken, that sandwiches the fig tree thing. In other words, the others have the fig tree, but it doesn't have it two times. And Mark has the fig tree, which is odd, then the cleansing of the temple, which has some real meaning and strange, but at least you understand more about that than you would about killing a tree. And then he comes back to the tree, as if to say, to help maybe clean up and clarify the meaning of the tree. But then it seemed odd to me when I first read it again. Then it's almost like they're still in the same moment, but then it's like Jesus changes the subject so radically. Have faith in God, and all is not lost, friends. And not only is he trying to encourage them, but it does seem, as you're saying, to say in a very quick way, you don't even need this system anymore. It's not just we needed to reform the church, kind of, or reform the temple, like we needed to reset its priorities. No, the whole system is coming to an end. And Jesus says in a few words, which will be unpacked later, of course, have faith in God, believe in Jesus, learn what it means to experience forgiveness directly. I am the temple, as you said. My body is the temple, as he'll say in a few chapters. But also learn to forgive each other. And you can do that without the infrastructure of this religious system, which is mind-blowing. Yes. And of course, the communion which we shared is the shorthand, the bread, the loaves, and the fishes. This is it. We have access to God, access to forgiveness, access to ongoing grace, and the ability not only to experience at deeper levels our forgiveness, to know it better, even if God has forgiven us in some heavenly transactional way, to know forgiveness better, but to also forgive. That's how he ends the passage. So it's like you don't need an elaborate structure for that. You need me. I'm the temple.
Wow. Yeah, that is a great way to end it.
Yep.
We don't need an elaborate structure. We need Jesus.
Right.
And to remind ourselves the forgiveness that's available there for us. And I think maybe for us even to consider, in our groups, are there areas that we need to experience that forgiveness? Forgiveness with others, forgiveness that we need to extend, or forgiveness that we need to receive? Where is that? Because that is so foundational in all of this.
Yeah.
So why don't you start by even thinking about that or processing that together? And hopefully this will continue to get us thinking as far as what does it really mean to be citizens of heaven.
Yeah. How does being more the church as it was designed to be, right? You and me, us as a congregation, how can that help us serve our world better?
Yes. Yeah. Great question. Well, thanks again, Rob. Appreciate it. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you back here next time on Between Two Sermons.